We can start. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the organization committee and the organization staff for being here, and also by greeting the members of this panel and of the audience. I would like to present myself. I'm Rafael. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo. I'm presenting on behalf of Professors Leandro Medrano and Luis Recamã, and also of the PhD candidate Mariana Videron. They are all here, all of us from the University of São Paulo. I would also like to say that Professors Recamã and Medrano follow the conference. In fact, they were here in the first conference, and this is quite important for our research group to follow these ideas about the post-criticism, right? And we think this is quite important for quite essential for the contemporary critics of architecture, about the contemporary theory and production of architecture, even in the underdeveloped country as Brazil. And we will be presenting an anthology that is in fact 3 books from Alexander Cuthbert. He's an Australian professor and that teaches in the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And Cuthbert has addressed questions about urban design since the 80s. In fact, during the 80s and 90s, his papers and articles were mostly about Hong Kong, about urban plans there, and not only about criticism of these urban plans, of urban design, but also he had some proposals for that plans how could I say that could be done instead of what was proposed then. And at that moment, he also had he diagnosed and tried to make strategies about pedagogical strategies to teach urban design. So at that moment, during the 80s and 90s, his work was mostly related to practice of urban design. But at the beginning of the 2000s, he diagnosed what he thought was an absence or a lack of theoretical foundations for urban design. And what he proposed was this long-term research that came out as 3 books, a long-term anthology. The first one, Designing Cities, in 2003. The second one, Form of Cities, in 2006. And the last one, Understanding Cities, in 2011. So I'll be talking about what is this, the Cuthbert's diagnosis of this lack of theoretical basis for urban design, his conception of anthology, and how his conception can be found in this trilogy. So the first book was published in 2003, Designing Cities, and we could say that this book is what is closer from the canonical, the traditional anthology, where he really assembles texts and organized them in 10 different themes: theory, history, philosophy, politics, culture, gender, environment, aesthetics, typologies, and pragmatics. He uses these 10 themes because he thinks that they can really create a relational basis to start this new discipline of urban design. And these themes are most related to the theory of urban design, right? So he says that another themes could be important as law, economics, or management, but these themes would be more related to the practice of urban design, not really about a theory that he's searching for. He also clearly says that the texts are selected not for their independent relevance, but by the relational basis that they create. So he says that there are a lot of important texts that are in there, but these texts were quite autonomous in their agenda. And what's important for him here in this anthology is to create these relations between the texts. Yeah, this is it. And then I did this quickly in the morning, have in mind the graphs that Sylvia showed us yesterday. So we can see here that the editors and also the authors are quite Western and in fact Anglo-Saxon. So this is a limitation that he also acknowledges that he's talking about a quite specific scope of texts and a quite specific scope of what could be this new urban design discipline. So the second book is The Form of Cities. This is some sort of textbook. It's a commentary of the text and themes of the first book, Designing Cities. And in fact, he not only comments, but also inserts other texts that he couldn't insert in the first one for editorial problems, right? So the second book is more of a commentary of Designing Cities and Understanding Cities. The last one is really a synthesis of the discussion. And in that one, he tries to do not a theory, but what he calls a meta-theory or a meta-method, something that comes before the theory, before the method, that could really be the basis to develop this. So according to Cuthbert, I think we can summarize the three books, this project, as this foundation of the urban design discipline, a discipline that should be different from architecture and also from urban planning, that should have, in opposition to the self-referential mainstream urban design, this is his words, to be a discipline grounded on social sciences, and that would have, as a discipline, it would have a research subject, and this theoretical subject would be the civil society, and the empirical subject would be the public realm. This would be the basis through which he would use the social sciences to create this new urban design discipline. I think that the major difference then between this anthology and more canonical ones is that the selected texts do not intend in their association to create a general meaning, but they reaffirm the fragmentary perspective that he's talking about. We will have, in fact, another presentation today about this. And he also says that he doesn't want to classify the production, or what is really the aim, the objective of this research is to reflect about the conditions of existence of the contemporary urban design, and this would be the basis to which he does his research. I would also like to highlight that the three books were published throughout 8 years. So the time passes, and this can be seen in the books. And this in two senses. The first one is really the emphasis that he uses in each theme, what he's talking about. So I chose here two examples. Aesthetics, the text that he chooses, and I think we can understand better what I'm talking about, the relation. They are quite different between them. So the first one is from an Australian professor about the subject reception of aesthetical reception. The second text from Aldo Rossi is more related to objectual aesthetics. And the third one talks about this symbolic currency of urban forms. In The Form of Cities, he addresses more a subject about the criticism of beauty, and as the sole or unique aesthetical principle. So he is against this. And in the last book, he's mostly talking about this global circuit of urban forms and how these images are a currency internationally. I think we can understand this change, this transformation of his concepts also in environment, where in the first book, I think the concept of environment isn't quite clear. So he talks about the car dependency, the first text from another professor from Australia. The second text is about a non-human city, about how other lives as animals or flora could come to the city as a part of an architectural agenda. And the last text is a quite different conception from what we have today about environment. It's about architectural heritage and conservation. But we can see how in the second book, The Form of Cities, it becomes really a criticism of sustainability as we understand it after the 80s. And in the last book, I think he has a more broad view to understand environment as a criticism of these dual concepts of capitalism as downtown and suburban, city and countryside, and city and nature. And also as it has the second question that I would address about this time passing is that we can really see how the historical events that happened in this decade, we can find them in the books. So the 9/11 was really in the beginning of the designing cities, but we can discover the consequences, clearly discover the consequences of 9/11 in the other books. We can also see a reference to the mortgage crisis, to the refugee crisis. And I think this is part of what he thinks would be this anthology. An anthology and a foundation of a discipline that is constantly changing and evolving through time to gather these new historical events. So in conclusion, I would say that what interested us in our research group is this sense that Cuthbert has to understand anthology also as criticism. So he really uses both of them together, trying to understand how both of them can create a new discipline more related to this idea of, today we could say of post-truth, but also of globalization, of this economic crisis that we have, more related to the 21st century. And we have also to acknowledge that there's a limit there, because we are Brazilians, and what we are talking about is quite different. So this necessity of an anthology and also an ontology of urban space in Brazil is yet to be done. And in fact, this is an ongoing project that we are doing today. And this project, this research project we are doing today with a lot of partnerships, in fact, between the University of São Paulo, but also the University of Harvard. Here, the Polytechnique de Madrid with Professor Carmen Spiegel, right? Pronouncing right? TU Delft and the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. That's it. Muchas gracias.
My name is Belén Butragueño. I'm here on behalf of my colleagues Javier Raposo and Maria Salgado. We are going to develop a presentation called Digitology. We first would like to thank Silvia and Luis for allowing us to do this conference virtually, as we are not able to be with you today. We'll try to analyze the role of theorization in the current architectural practice, questioning the validity of traditional theoretical compilations in the digital era. To illustrate this perspective, we will work through the evolution of Rem Koolhaas, which is one of the maximal representative figures in this field. Our presentation departs from the idea that there is a disengagement of the practicing architects versus scholarship profiles. That is one of the biggest challenges regarding the process of collecting and classifying the current architectural production. We consider that traditional systems that gave a still picture of the moment are no longer valid in a moment where instability is one of the qualities of our field. So we think we should go to systems that could give a full perspective of the discipline in every moment with constant updating. This is what we call digitology. As we say at the beginning, we are going to walk through Remco's thinking about this issue to illustrate what we want to do. He thinks that there is an increasing gap between the theoretical and the practical activity in architecture. In his article, Thinking and Doing, which is in content, Remco makes a curious comparison between the manifestos addressed in the 20th century and the urban development in the world. The analysis of those data lead to very important conclusions. The first is that architectural theorization has been developed basically in Europe and North America, whereas the most intense and important urban development of the last years have been undertaken in Asia. Secondly, the research and theoretical activity has declined radically since 1970, whereas the urban activity has exponentially increased since that date. In 2002, Remco met Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi to celebrate the 30 years of the publication of Learning from Las Vegas. In that interview, they were talking about how the modern movement had left some kind of parkland scenario regarding the theoretical practice. Robert Venturi considers that there has been no in-depth reflection in the processes, media, and content for which the built environment can issue information to the user, nor the mental processes that provide information to the image that develop a building, or the implications of such perception in the image of construction. He thinks that architectural mechanisms of representation have not been explicitly analyzed since the modern movement, and argues that it is necessary to review that approach, understanding the double condition of the architectural communication, the built element, and the architectural narrative. At present, there is a clear divergence between theory and practice in architecture. Theorization has been confined in universities and schools of architectures all over the world that have abandoned the architectural practice or practical research, in many cases due to a lack of resources. At the same time, studios working on architectural production have not developed the necessary theoretical processes that could support their activity, as they are usually immersed in a frenetic activity and there is not a remaining time for reflection on theoretical subjects. However, it is possible to find some examples through history of architects whose architectural practice relies on an important theoretical background, such as Le Corbusier or Colas himself. Le Corbusier is without a doubt his predecessor in this invented category of practical theorization. Many authors compare both of them because of their media talent and ability to make visionary suggestions on the future. Also, Remco retrieves the tradition of pragmatic theorizing. His design methodology requires theorizing and translating the conclusions into practice. The system includes a systematic recording of every document developed in the process in an almost compulsive manner. As I say, there's an almost compulsive obsession with the production of publications, recording, and documentation of processes and ideas. OMA is set to issue one publication per day. In many cases, it is rather an internal record that helps them to assimilate their ideas while inventorying them. The archive is constantly revisited in order to bring light to new designs, to address strategies such as self-recycling, one of OMA's favorite design formulas. We can see it in this image of Casa da Música do Porto, which was the result of the recycling of the year 2000 house made some months before. OMA's archive contained more than 10,000 works of paper and more than 3,000 boxes with models, samples, and other objects. They were inventoried as an initiative of the National Architecture Institute of Rotterdam that had the intention to acquire the archive. Finally, Rem Koolhaas didn't sell it because he understood that outsourcing these documents meant burying the creative processes in OMA. In the exhibition, OMA Book Machine, curated by Brett Steele and Thad Kais in 2010 at the Architectural Association, they show the work of Beatriz Colomina and her students at Princeton University, consisting in the creation of a mega book that contained more than 40,000 pages and guarded more of the books, pamphlets and publications developed by OMA since 1978. That book showed that it's not enough with having the knowledge. It is important to find a way to address the data managing, especially in the era of big data, in order to these documents to be useful for themselves and the rest of the users. Although we are defending that Rem Koolhaas' works is supported in the use of practical theorization, it is also fair to say that what he does is to separate these two aspects in two different offices that work together, but they have very specific fields. That was the reason for the creation of AMO as a parallel and independent entity from OMA that could focus on purely theoretical subjects, regardless of a previous commission on it or any other engagement to the conditions of the market. AMO operates in areas beyond the traditional boundaries of architecture, including media, politics, sociology, renewable energy, technology, fashion, curating, publishing, and graphic design. AMO often works in parallel with OMA's clients, to fertilize architecture with intelligence from this array of disciplines. In this regard, we bring here this interesting diagram on the different activities of the office and how they are related in order to influence the architectural practice and thought. One of the most interesting examples of the cohabitation of these two areas is the work that OMA and AMO developed for Prada. AMO usually investigates aspects related to identity, technology, materials, and new production possibilities in the world of fashion, whereas OMA works in the architectural design in the new flagship stores for Los Angeles, New York, or Prada Foundation in Milan, applying AMO's findings. The appearance of AMO corresponds to a moment of deep crisis in the office that forced them to undertake profound changes in the structure of OMA and its constitution. The process started with the publication of the book SMLXL, which meant the biggest success in history of architectural publications. This book led to Rem Koolhaas to maximum recognition and has become a fetish object and a reference for anyone involved in the architectural design of publishing. AMO was at the same time determined to open the interest of architectural topics to a wider audience by addressing the problems that actually matters to the society. That was their intention when they published Content in 2004. This half-book, half-magazine tried to support from an ironic and satirical perspective the idea that architecture must be much more engaged with society and with the mass culture. In the interview Rem Koolhaas kept with Beatriz Colomina, they talked about a concept that is in the origin of all this crisis, which is the concept of generics. He addressed this issue of generics in their Manifesto for Simplicity that they developed in 2008, and through a comparison of how you can create a skyline for a city like Dubai with iconic buildings, and it could be exactly the same skyline if you use generic buildings from unknown or anonymous architects. It tries to address the issue of the damage iconic architecture has been doing to the development of the cities. So we can conclude that AMO frees OMA from the dependence of the global market, and generics frees OMA from the need of the permanent form innovation. The creation of these entities sustains Koolhaas' concept of theorization based on permanent link with the architectural practice. He considers both tools as essential for the development of the discipline with an implicit interaction between them. With this panorama, what's next? We can conclude that the EMU's first achievement was to insert the theorization in the communication strategy. The deep analysis in this strategy and its information management has allowed us to extrapolate it to the state of art of research and design. The inclusion of the record, and not only the compilation, as part of both the design process and the researching process allows an exponential growth of the experimentation and creativity in both disciplines and enables the possible data interchange. It could also enable the creation of a global database that could take advantage of the advanced develops around big data mapping. We won't get in deep in this issue, but specialists consider 5 dimensions when speaking about big data: volume, variety, velocity, veracity, and value. Regarding our field of study, we might include one very important concept, which is visualization. The possibility of having spatial comprehension of the data allows us, as researchers, to answer questions and ask new ones. There is a very interesting research project developed by the Social Computing Group at MIT Media Lab called You Are Here. The group is an interdisciplinary laboratory consisting of computer scientists, mathematicians, artists, architects, designers, and educators whose goal is to map 100 different cities around the world. This research integrates techniques in data mining and visualization to connect people with information, social computational techniques to connect people with one another, and cultural and artistic techniques to help unlock the human potential. The data digitalization allows the intermediate and transversal analysis of data, which enables the detection of patterns and the cross-referencing of information, multiplying the possible interpretations and implementations of data and consequently the creation of a new reality. One of the most interesting aspects of this project is the lack of preconceptions. The data talk by themselves, and it's the researcher who draws conclusions. The digital technology is what enables immediate connection and encourages reflection. This is a good example of a link between graphic processes and the digital data collection. This will allow us to create a system to enable the instant interchange of knowledge, breaking the barriers of bureaucracy and oligarchy of scientific journals. This fact will mean the equivalence to a wide level of scholar research, some kind of generic research. Like Bruce Mau explained, every new social condition demands and creates new visual forms of expressing the new ideas. That is the reason why we address this concept of digitology as the digital collection of data with interactive purposes. But this must come together with a new visual language that strengthens the topics addressed. The communicative strategy will be fundamental not only regarding the interface of a possible operating system for the data sharing, but also as an essential tool of research, especially when facing topics related to architecture. We borrowed this diagram from the book Steps to an Ecology of Mind of Gregory Bateson. The goal is not to decode a message through a language, but to create a context that is capable of generating partial and fragmented interpretations that expands the object's perspective. The concept of visualization in information leads us once again to Recontextualization. In his studio, the communicative strategy acquires the same importance as the message that is intended to convey, because it has the potential to strengthen and even transform it. That is what he calls information design. As our perception of reality is based on its representation, this means that information and visibility are a whole. This leads to the necessary convergence between the story to be told and the way to do it, because the concept and the communicative strategy collide. We have different strategies for different stories to tell, as we can see on the next images. In conclusion, there are 2 possible lines of research that might collude. The first one is the transposition of research data into big data mapping, and the other one is the graphic treatment given to this mapping in order to encourage the maximal interchange of knowledge and the future advances of the discipline. The instrumental use of digital media in the practices of researching and communicating with the use of visual tools might encourage the intellectual management of communication. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I hope this small lecture gives some points for the further discussion that I would love to join.
Okay, thank you very much for accepting our paper and for organizing this conference. My name is Mattias Kärrholm. I'm from the School of Architecture in University of Lund. Another co-writer that is not here is Paulina Prieto de la Fuente, who is also a researcher at the School of Architecture in Lund, and we have also Rodrigo Delso from this school.
From here, we are here.
Yeah. So, in this piece, Catching Glimpses, the Fragment Anthology as a Strategy for Architectural Research, we want to investigate the relation between autonomy and authority, if you will, the autonomy of the parts of the fragments and its relation to the authority of the editor or of the whole of the anthology. We also want to investigate if an anthology can be used in research as a mean rather than as an end. So, as a strategy for producing new questions and new knowledge, rather than as a way of showing something that is already known. So let the anthology produce a set of living questions which transforms as you work with them, both as an author and as a reader of the anthology. In the text, in the proceedings, we start with the problem of the title of the anthology, the title which kind of boxes the whole set of questions. And of course, the naming, it is well known that naming is a very powerful thing. I mean, already ancient Rome had two different names, one secret name and one well-known name. So the problem, the giving name to something is a very powerful thing, could be problematic. And we give, as a first example of how to deal with this problem, the Brazilian author Clarice Lispector's final work, The Hour of the Star, which actually had 13 titles rather than one. And I'm not sure about the history, if she was forced by the publisher to finally set one name to the back of the book, but on the title page, you can see these 13 titles, and we have The Hour of the Star as number 2 of these 13. And for me, Lispector makes it very clear that both for her as an author and for the reader, the understanding and the processing of reading the text must be an ongoing process. You must always rethink it from a new perspective.
If we can all agree that anthologies are made of fragments, then the process of giving it a name is a very important feature of the anthology, and also problematic, because, but also very explanatory, because a name, it always implies, a title always implies a definition, and maybe some authors even agree that the title is the book amplified. So this title, for example, after Marcos Pantaleon talked yesterday quoting Hayes, we reread the introduction of Hayes, and he said that he selected the text of each author because the ones that have more explanatory power, explaining and power. So the act of making a definition is always an act of placing a boundary. You locate a certain area of knowledge and you place it on the spotlight by separating it from each other, from other areas, kind of enclose it and placing that boundary. One of the biggest questions in our research with fragments, if how this boundary is static, it can be moved or it can be blurred through the fragment, because the fragment in itself has many potentials. One of them that is very important is that it can construct different narratives. It doesn't have one single narrative within it, and instead, when we define it and we place it in a collection, somehow, despite the claims of universality, it's always partial. Hayes always also talks in the introduction a lot about the world is a totality. The world is a totality, and we that both like a lot of fragments, we like more to think the world from fragments than from totalities. And in this sense, there are many people that has worked with the power and also the risks that we will talk later of the fragments. It's very interesting, the 18th century landscape architects, which the main representative is Francis Bacon, that they always purposely leave gaps in their works. Even if they are from the field of science, they always did uncompleted, unfinished catalogs, atlas, natural histories, because they want others to continue and purposely leave these gaps using a technique of writing that is very fragmentary, which is and very usually negative in research terms, which is the aphorism. They really like the aphorism, and they thought it was a very interesting research method, because even if it's very doctrinal, it can make someone continue the work. It's never complete and completely rational. And also it's very interesting the work of the Oulipo group, the Œuvre de Littérature Potentielle, which Raymond Queneau was part of it, because, for example, Maurice Blanchot always fostered his followers to write fragments, to do unworked text in order to reach the silence that is prior to language and allow real communications. If the Oulipo group was here, or yesterday in the debate about anthologies as the framework for theory, they will tell us that the framework is not a matter of something that has to be delivered by one in the hierarchy, a professor, a president, or a mass media communication, but the framework, it's always something that is self-produced or more independent, or has to be fostered, the self-production of that. There are other examples, like Manfredo Tafuri and his fight always for non-linearity, of not being able to describe, as Sola Morales, as cause and effect, the contemporary experience. Roland Barthes in this book that he also experiments with the format and the way of writing through fragments, because he says that the lover's discourse, the love, is always is related to solitude. So if we want to make a book about love, it has to take account of the multiple voices. So he uses and writes through fragments in order to multiply the voices, the meanings, the complexities, and of course the notion of the bricoleur of Levi-Strauss, of found objects, to assemble them in a different way.
Okay, so if we go back in science, the history of science and the history of research, we see that early science were very often built up by cases and fragments, even in the natural sciences. So if we take well-known scholars as Richard Burton in his Anatomy of Melancholy, or Frazier's Golden Bow and so on, they were made up of small cases which were allowed to shine light on each other rather than always respond back to kind of a main quest. And of course, we cannot escape Walter Benjamin. The Arcade project was mentioned yesterday, and it's a very good example of a fragmentary anthology, or collection at least. And we also have this very good quote where Gilloch describes Benjamin's approach. For Benjamin, the truth content of a thing is released only when the context in which it originally existed had disappeared, when the surfaces of the object have crumbled away and it lingers precariously on the brink of extinction. So you could say that recontextualization is the price of the fragment, in a sense that the fragment opens up for the possibility of a multitude of connections. And we can relate this, I think, to maybe to Michel Serres' concept of blankness, and to Hetherington's work with this concept about the will to connect. And I think the fragment is more about the will to connect than about the will to withdraw. So the fragment is about creating new connections. It's a kind of blank object that has agency written all over it, one could perhaps express it. And for Benjamin, of course, he was a collector himself, collected all kinds of things, books, children's toys. The collector knows that when you make a new find, it can suddenly create a whole world of new connections, actually restructuring the whole collection, change the whole course of your collection. So it's the figure of the collector is also an interesting aspect which connects to this topic.
And it also has a lot of risks to work with the fragment. I see this slide is horrible. It's like pros and cons of the fragment, very didactic. But one feature that has been explored a lot is the condition of being open-ended of the fragment, of being able to account for more, and many research methods and many ways of writing have been developed. The most famous one is the hypertext. I think we all know the hypertext. It's a set of connections. It's a system that fosters the relation between concepts instead of the concept itself, and makes the reader take an extra effort, but also an extra reward on its learning. The thing I think is very interesting at this point, and the debate that happened yesterday about education, it's also that fragments, in some sense, they have the risk of abstraction, of making no sense. But in the end, it's also a matter of time. Time is at the essence when we talk about education, but when we talk about anthologies and fragments, fragments take much more time from us to make meaning, to understand something. And anthologies, in this sense, if we think anthologies in this sense, maybe it's a tool to reduce the time of learning, to accelerate theory and knowledge, and in this sense, more related to a manual, didactic, than real education or real research, which is more related with pedagogy. We think, at least me, when we talk about education, I get very emotional. The hypertext or the fragment that takes much, is much more demanding than the anthology, or the fragment anthology is much more demanding from us than the classical anthology. The fragment lets us explore new fields and being lost. But being lost, when we talk about education or pedagogy, we think it's a part that is interesting. It's a risk, but there is also a reward.
Yeah. We also write a little about the fragment as a glimpse. It's also a relation between the fragment and time. And there are several researchers who have argued that by a simple glance we can judge very complex situations, so we can take in a whole world in a matter of a split second. It's a very, very powerful thing, the glance. Especially Casey, the philosopher, has written about it in his book, The World at a Glance. And this powerfulness of a quick glance could sometimes be more, I think, powerful than the stare. And that's kind of the thing that you often do as an architectural critique or as a reader. You stare at the text, you stare at the object, you wait too long for it, in a sense. And the power of the glance is that it might be this situation of formlessness before something is purely decided, if it's a living thing or if it's a dead thing, for example, if it's a subject or if it's an object. If you encounter something, a scenery at night, for example, you can have this feeling of what is it that is alive and what is it that is dead. And it might take some time before you can start sorting and classifying things. And the fragment, in this sense, we argue that to fragmentize is to let live, or to create this hope of life, or kind of an animistic moment, which is a very creative moment, which could be used in explorative ways, and have, of course, been used in explorative ways by architects and artists through the centuries. And of course, this animistic moment is both a possibility and a risk. The same goes with the fragment as the cacophonic, the problem of chaos, when you deal with too many fragments, when you cannot make any sense of it. So the polyphonic promise that we see in the fragment gets lost in the kind of the cacophonic aspect.
Also interesting when architects, when we work with theory, we also use the fragment also very cacophonic way, no? So we think that it needs more time, but it's not a problem of total coherence, but of understanding or learning, and let us speak and blur these hardcore boundaries of the process of learning knowledge. Of course, the independent and unfinished feature of fragments is important. If we think of restoration of heritage, we see that sometimes we find fragments of buildings, and we have to reconstruct an imaginary past that probably is really, really imaginary in a present that is completely decontextualized. And instead of thinking, we think of restoration of fragments to go back to a previous inexistent past. We think that the concept of spolia, the Roman concept of spolia, which is a very negative term, like something is spoiled. We have spoiled this presentation, this space. Spolia is very interesting because spolia means that you take a fragment, completely decontextualize it, and place it in another sense. You somehow, one process of spolia also recontextualize at least one, adds meanings to the fragment instead of going for a coherence that is always partial. So the concept of spolia lets the fragment live. But also, when we talk about the spolia, we are talking also about savage knowledge. We know that traditional knowledge, alternative knowledge, is very related to fragmentary thinking. It's more topological, cosmological, it's more relational, but we know it's completely shadowed, as De Sousa Santos told us and explains, through the absence, through the not being worthy of attention, and fragmentary thinking, usually, and fragments in research and in education, it's always thought of or made invisible because there is not something that you really want to say. There is some lack of coherence, even if they make sense. And for creative fields, this approach that is more divergent and not ultra coherent could be interesting, and for us in architectural research is interesting. But also fragments can create monsters. Monsters in the negative part, but also in the positive part, that monsters are the unknown things that we are afraid of them because they can change things, kill things, or eliminate things. And it's interesting, this movie is Ghost in the Shell, which talks a lot about fragments, but in the end, the question is how much a robot can be a human if the mind is human, or how much a machine is a machine if they are in a human body and the brain is an algorithm. So in this sense, we have to, when we work with fragments, and of course in research and in education, in the university, in the academia, we have to face this controversy of creating monsters in both ways. And maybe we finish with some fragmentary conclusions, which wouldn't be very coherent with what we have said, or yes, I don't know. But very quick, we think that the entry point to any text, any research, it's very important, and as long as it opens up from the beginning, the beginning of the narration, as many lines as it can open, it's very important to not close and blur a little bit the boundary of any naming, any definition that we can do. We think that knowledge and fragmentary thinking plays in the middle of the debate, that knowledge is an ongoing material that cannot be frozen, that cannot be established and thought as a static entity. It's always an ongoing material, and fragments really explicit that in knowledge, or for example, that we think that English landscape architects purposely create gaps in our research, in our education. It's an interesting method to allow others to jump in the creation or the process of learning in the education.
Here are the last points. So I could just read some of them. Both anthologies of fragmentology share the commitment to preciseness in research that should not be confused with ultra-coherence. We also talked about the idea of the glance, a fragment that works through effects, atmosphere, and animism, where the question of life, as well as the title, what is a subject and object, might yet to be set. So this is the idea about the formlessness. Avoid the introduction of authoritative context that legitimize certain forms of knowledge and research methods over other, propel the strength of the weak in investigations. To me, this is also very much about what John Law talks about in his book After Method, Making a Mess of Social Science. It relates a little bit to that. And finally, maybe we are always assembling pieces. There are never ultimate wholes. So this is also about thinking not only from the author's perspective, but also from the reader's perspective and from the researcher that comes after you, from their perspective. And I will end with just a short anecdote. I tried myself actually to write a fragmentary anthology some 5-6 years ago. Sent it to a big publisher and they were interested, but they didn't say yes. So I tried to convince them for 2 years, could you please publish it? And they said, they didn't say yes, but they didn't say no. So after 3 years, 4 years, I tried to make them say no, so I could go on with it. But they never said no, so finally I just got tired of waiting. I sent it after 4 years to another kind of large publisher, and they said, after 2 weeks, they came back and said, no, we don't publish anthologies anymore. They are too expensive to pay the royalties. So now I turned that project on ice. The possibility of a fragment anthology is still open, you could say. We'll see if there ever will be. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to present our paper. I'm Guido Chimo from the School of Architecture at Malaga University, and this work has been developed together with Ruben Garcia from Dubai, not able to come for this event, and with an undergraduate student at Malaga, this Vishal, and he's working on his trabajo fin de grado, so that's more important than being here at the moment. There is, to be the last one to talk after 2 days of discussions about anthologies, has the risk to repeat some of the themes already raised up. But for this reason, please don't take my word literally. I would like to provoke a bit. And the paper is much more rigorous and serious than what I'm going to show you now. The starting point of this research that started only a few months ago is the reconnaissance of how society influences and informs architecture. It has been in the past, and it is this way also in the present. So that what I'm more interested in is how contemporary society is being transformed by information, tools, technologies, and social networks. And the transformation is so fast that could be threatening because the effects are very difficult to be recognized, first of all. And if something emerged, I think, from the discussion of these 2 days is that an anthology, editing an anthology is a critical work. So that always we choose what to present and leave apart what we are not interested in or we are against or theory, so that it is part of other critics to put these things again into the framework of the discussion. But this is a quote by Stella Morales about the role of critics. But if we look at contemporary society, we can see in other fields of society, not architecture, we can see that critics are disappearing. Critics and mediators. If we think about any e-commerce website, who decide if a good is worth to be bought or if it is suitable for our users are other users. We don't have somebody that help us to decide what is best for us. In travels, holidays travels is the same. Who says if it's worth to go to a place, the local to visit, the spot to visit? Other users who were there. So for example, the travel agent is disappearing. And I'm asking myself, is also going the architectural critic to disappear in the future? This slide already appeared yesterday, and what I just interested in James' work is his ability to attempt, at least to attempt, to visualize future trends. And in some way to, as he talks in his architecture beyond 2000, to predict the future. I'm not going to agree if he was right or not, but at least there is this attempt making, we can see in the 69, he already recognized a lot of practice and categorized them. Technology helped Apollo to only make a slide of the present of one of the 6 labels that James recognized. It's a compass of political architecture, and it recognizes more than 150 practices in the world, much more globalized, thanks to technology we have today. Again, the only interest in at the moment on this compass is the complexity of the present. How many practices exist and how also they change, as somebody told yesterday, from one moment to the other. Not a fixed frame of the present. Back to social network, I think that when we search something, we all, at the end, arrive to one of these platforms, which are repositories of architectural projects at their best. Some of them also present other issues related with architecture. There is not Instagram here. Instagram is, I realize it's increasing its relevance in architecture field, especially in the USA, but as it is only an image platform, at the moment I prefer not to talk about it. These platforms are maybe like archives of architecture, and they present interesting opportunities, but also threats for architecture. For example, the importance of instantaneity. I think that the recorded presentation talked about the same aspect. How a project can be seen instantaneously, also if it has been realized far away from where we live. Something that with previous tools like journals and magazines was not possible. They are open to different experiences, cultural, geographical, and they also raise the issue of veracity. of the built against the unbuilt. Today it's very difficult to recognize if it is a 3D representation or a real project sometimes, so that there is this issue. But also, they are democratic tools, because they have to publish a lot of projects, another issue, but they publish work from students, from recognized practices, from architects that just make the work without attempting to reach an audience, so that it is possible to learn a lot from these tools. We focused on Art Daily. We focused on the analyzing Art Daily because in some way it is one of the first results in our Google searches. And looking at Amazon Alexa, which is make a rank of web pages, we can see how Art Daily is highly ranked about every web pages existing on the web. And we see how something less than 50% of I don't find, okay, that around 50% of the visit to the web page come from the USA, China, and India. Plataforma Arquitectura, which is the same context, but in Spanish language, is lower on the rank, but we can see how also 50% of the projects, of the visits, come from Argentina, Chile, which is the origin of the platform, Spain, and also China. So that they cover a huge amount of users. What we did was scraping the portal with some tools. We throw a spider, how it's called, to look at all the pages existing in Art Daily. The results were more than 3 million pages. From these 3 million pages, we had more than 100,000 projects, items that we could recognize as projects. And filtering them again, because there are repeated ones and so on, we reached the number of 26.790 projects, which is, according to what we could read on the web page, the 78% of the whole projects published the day we closed our search. The spider was working for more than 25 days. That's not a very immediate task. And, well, short results about what we found. Results that we have to work more on them. First of all, countries with a large amount of projects published. We can see that 25% of the projects published on Art Daily came from the USA, Spain, and Japan. And following them, there is France, Australia, China. So that it is in some way a reflection of the users that visit the web page, the user that look at us daily for something. There is a correlation that can be interesting. We can also see how there are a lot of projects of countries with really few projects at the moment. We have Sierra Leone with one project, Madagascar with one project, but maybe thought that it is possible to know architecture realized in other countries, in very far countries, and in few years maybe the number of projects also will increase. The number of projects published is, of course, another aspect to consider. Plataforma Architettura was created in 2008. So here we can see the number of projects published the projects realized in the same year they were published. Exponential increase in the first years, and then a stabilization of the number of projects. So that maybe the publishing users of the platform has reached a critical level. Maybe it's not going to publish much more projects every year. And here on the right, we can see projects completed or labeled as finished in year previous to the year of they were published. Of course, when the platform is more famous, more consolidated, you can publish projects you finished earlier. So that's logic. Well, this is a graphic of this trend, just to understand it a bit more. Another issue is related with categories. ArchDaily has really a lot of categories, very specific ones, but they are also englobed in more global ones. What we can see at a glance, they are global results of all the projects existing in the platform. Is that residential is a very important typology of architecture. We cannot say it is the more realized typology, of course, but at least the one that is more published. We can see for countries, again, the relation between each of these categories. What's interesting to focus on is that it is an easy way to localize a specific typology everywhere in the world as a tool for architects that are going to design something. It's an easy way to recognize what has been done, solution proposed by other architects, so that, especially for students, I think it's really wide used for this scope, but also for professionals, of course. These are the same data, but only related to Spain. Here we can see, again, how residential is a very important typology, but there are also important volume of other projects. And another thing that is interesting to see here is that half of the projects published after 2010 were single houses and rehabilitation, which is reflect the crisis we had, of course. Another aspect we look at is the number, well, the offices, the practices with the highest number of projects published. This is not a rank that can be seen by the users, only analyzing the data we recompiled, and well, nothing that can surprise us, probably, at least until we look at the fifth in the list, which is Apollo Architects. It is a Japanese practice. We Googled, we asked to other professionals we know related with this country if Apollo Architects is a renowned studio. Not so much renowned, but it's rising attention that, again, that's at the same level as Hadid or Oma or other more renowned architects. There are a lot of analysis that can be done with this data. It's not open data, but it's not very difficult to recollect it. We want to do the same with the other platforms. Also, if the structure is different and we have to work on it. But what's interesting to think about is there are a lot of themes to rise. The first of them, that these platforms are not open to comments of the users, like the one we were talking before. I cannot comment a project, which is a kind of critic to the project, so that giving the role of the critic to the user. Maybe in the future it will be more, it will be possible. Another thing is related with how more and more the information about projects is visual. Of course, we all know it. But this issue raises the question if anthologies should be based on text in the future or rely more and more on images, which raises the question if we are prepared or we are preparing students to use images properly for these scopes. Maybe they are anthologies of contemporary architecture. There rises other problems which we were talking yesterday, that it is difficult to recognize on the web when first appeared an image or a commentary or a project. So that's difficult to reconstruct the framework, cultural, social framework, when something appeared. So that this will be an issue in the future when we will try to do an history of architecture of contemporary digital age, because we won't know from where started a trend or an idea, just an idea. Well, what we are thinking at the moment is that these repositories are becoming the main context for the architectural history of this digital age. So at least it is important to recognize them, to analyze them, and to think about how they can help us to continue writing on architecture.
Thank you for all the participants of this morning group of opponents. Well, I would start by saying that the feeling that I have after seeing these 4 presentations is that there's that we cannot locate the same discourse depending on the nature of the sources or the materials that different ontologies are using. Okay, so it's very different, to a kind of literary work to a kind of material produced in a professional practice or a published work. So I would say that maybe we could have some thoughts. What are your thoughts? Can we establish any general lines on the nature of anthologies that is independent from the source material? That would be my first question. And then my answer to that question would be that is, as the third group was commenting, like the relationship between autonomy and authority of the fragments, right? So the autonomy of the fragments supposedly floating by themselves, and the authority of the editor or the author by giving some meaning to them. In my opinion, there's the authority on the anthology is inevitable, and maybe one of the bonds between those 2 components, autonomy and authority, could be the notion of essay. So an essay can be something very individual, and therefore the nature of the authority is only of one author, or could be something more critically coordinated between a group. But I think the essay could be like in the center of this discussion, no matter the source material is. So I would like to hear your thoughts about it.
Have them. This is why I wanted you the microphone. I think about the source material of anthologies, Matthias and I were discussing, because we have this problem also from the Sage handbook between anthology as something that connects different authors from different times that are selected, or a handbook that you pick up authors to write or to rate this article. So for us here there is a big difference. And when we talk about the source material, I'm always thinking about Avi Barbour and his collections, cartographies of photographs. If Avi Barbour's photographs can be their thoughts in as an anthology, for me it's very difficult, because for me it's more related to cartography, and when an anthology is very related to written text. In my opinion, I would say, just to be clear in the definition, because if we start to blur basic definitions of knowledge, the debate starts to be very, very problematic. And this is when the cacophonic of the fragments start. And in this sense, fragments can also be authoritative. For example, Nietzsche used a lot aphorism and fragments to say clear, didactic, doctrinal things. But in some sense, they have can be easily reappropriated than, for example, anthologies that consciously and purposely try to deliver frameworks of things. But in the end, when we name something, of course we are saying something from the position that we have as a student, as a professor, or
First of all, I agree that an essay could be more personal than anthology, but I think that it is the anthology, when choose an essay to be published, rise the importance of this essay. It's no more a personal vision, but is a more important one. Is raised of a level of an important test for everybody. We said yesterday, many essays could be burned without any problem, and nobody would care about it. But when it is chosen to be published in an anthology, or more personal anthology that could be, recognizes the importance for a broader audience about what the author of the essay said. And related with, of course, an anthology is, we assume that it is a text, that it is a written text. But I think that it is because we all pushed PhD, we teach, so we are of an older generation than the one that is raised with technology. So that, well, my provocation is just thinking about the architects or people of the future. They are not reading. I think it is very hard to make your student to read something, a formal text. So that's what they do. They look at Instagram, at Twitter, at short text, fragments, that sometimes they start to read the whole hyperlinked text behind the fragment, sometimes not. But if this is the reality, I think it is very difficult to change it. If somebody has the solution, I would hear it. But if they are changing, how will it be in the future? Why publish new anthologies if nobody will read them? Or should they be configured in a different way, with much more important weight on images? Images can say a lot of things, of course. We see it at Shayark and so on. Of course, they give freedom to interpretation much more than a text. But if I assume, as everybody here, that we are going to follow on reading, if we think at future generation, what will happen? That's the question about anthology from my point of view.
Can say something shortly. I would just like to say, I think it was the first presentation yesterday who took up the etymology of the word anthology as a collection of flowers. I think that's an interesting origin of the concept, because it means that it's something already produced that you pick up, reassemble or assemble in a new way. So it's not a handbook with something written directly for the thing, but it's something that you pick. When it comes to the concept of anthology, I would say its connotations has to do with text today, but I mean, it's all concepts, they are open for change. So no problem if you want to change it into become an anthology of pictures and so on for me. But if you do it too quick, then someone would say it's not an anthology anymore. But if you do this change slowly, you can change it into anything you like. And we can ourselves be part of that by trying to change the anthology concept slowly.
In relation to your first question, I don't know if I'm properly responding it, but I'm trying to. When you said about the independency of the source material, right? What I think that maybe unifies our panel here is something that I listened to the debate yesterday, that anthologies they don't talk about the future, they talk about the past. And I think, in fact, that our panel is the opposite way, right? I think all of the contributions were talking in some sense of anthology as a form of knowledge that could address something in the future, some sort of positive agenda in some sense. So would answer the first question in this sense, the anthology as a form of knowledge that could unify our panel. And about the essay, I like your idea of essay as unifying autonomy and authority, right? I think in Brazil, I don't know how it works here in Europe, but I think in Brazil we are facing some sort of theoretical dilemma because I think we have a tradition of essays there, mostly related to the French and to the Frankfurt School. But recently we are more related to an Anglo-Saxon idea of papers that are comparable, right? I think it's maybe easier to make knowledge because it's easier to compare than an essay that's such an open format. I really don't have a position there. How we can do, what's the better pedagogical or epistemological way to produce, would be.
Like Rafael said, the most of our anthology that we saw since yesterday was about the history, so like a documentary about some important texts in the past who make some sense in some periods, and the difference about the work of Alexander Cuthbert is exactly that the way that they uses the anthology for looking for a new theory. It's exactly what we are doing now with this group, study group, with ETSAM, TU Delft, Harvard, and ETH, is looking for a new theory for today or for the future. We use the market of 2008 as a moment that the post-critical movement don't make more sense nowadays. The idea of the critical, or as we said, the post-critical is very important for us. We believe that we are in a moment that the disciplines don't make more sense in terms that we use the disciplines in the 90s, for example, believe in the neoliberal world like a kind of base who establish some relationship with the discipline, that the relation with his critical moment, like in the modern movement or in the beginnings of the 20th centuries, changed a lot in terms of the basis of this critical. Then we are start to recognize some tests and some new arguments nowadays that maybe make some sense in this new moment for the discipline. And we believe that this relationship between architecture and urbanism are very strong nowadays. In a different sense, like Curran said in the 90s, it's like this kind of distancing from the urbanism in your context are very important nowadays. The idea of urban design, of a very strong relationship between the buildings and the theme of the series, since the third space, like Vidra said in the 80s, are very important for us. In this sense, the thematic of the space, like a new argument, are two very important for us to understand what kind of space we can imagine in the cities of the futures, and what kind of space or studies or the architecture in the 21st century can believe to make some relationship with the new problems that we have after 2008 crisis in many senses of this.
Yeah, I think that that claim you're making for, let's say, the productive role of anthology, like in the case of Cuthbert, actually refers back to one of the main questions of the conference, which is it still something useful today? Is it obsolete or not? No? And I would argue that the two of you and also Belen respond affirmatively to this question with some redefinition, of course, and then I would argue that you don't accept from the outset that this format has been, let's say, overcome by other types of instruments. No, but in both cases, like I said, and you even proposed like new terms for the word ethology, like ethology in the case of Belen or Fragment. You seem to be pointing at this generative and relational and productive potential of anthologies, and not to the stabilizing, right? And the aim for completeness, all that perhaps traditional anthologies used to claim. So that makes me think, to what extent that type of interpretation or propositions for the future of anthologies has a lot to do actually with the structure and the qualities of the media themselves that we use today, basically to organize access, to communicate information. From the point of view of media theory, we could say that, or some authors say, that the main trait of digital media is basically that they abandon structurally a narrative form, which is the one characteristic for traditional media set, book or movie, pitch, where something follows a sequential ordering and has a beginning and has an end, in favor of a database form, a collection of discrete fragments that, because of the immateriality of their DNA, etc., have the ability to be constantly reorganized according to multiple inputs and all that. And that's what makes them interactive. Basically, they can interact with user, the beholder, etc., and be arranged in multiple infinite ways. Which is some of the ideas, I think, guys that are posing, the possibility of these fragments to not organize themselves or arrange themselves in a very static way, but to enable multiple narratives. In that, or from that perspective, I think that the interest to me and your papers resides precisely in what are the instruments that under those conditions are useful or interesting in order to activate a different way of organizing or editing narratives, if we assume that that is probably the most important characteristic of any anthology, something edited. And there are two that particularly are quite interesting to me, and I think that perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on them. One is the categories that we see in the case of Cuthbert's anthology. So the fact using categories that are stable, but can assume multiple topics and examples, and at least the lapse of time, which is one. And the second one is hyperlinking, I would say, because hyperlinking, interestingly enough, what it makes is that rather than organizing or articulating the narrative from the outside, it does it from the inside, no? From the fragments themselves, in a way, no? So you can navigate the concepts inside the fragment. It's one of the fragments, the references inside, and that takes you to another one and to another one. So you are able to, let's say, construct your own narrative or navigation, but following the content itself. No, so to that extent, I wonder if just by having a good editorial statement with a bunch of hyperlinks, you can actually construct these paths, leaving them open enough, but allowing also for some content or particular agenda to be explored. So.
I think, yeah, I'm happy with your reading of our presentation, which I agree with. Maybe I should make clear that I mean we were experimenting with how to develop anthologies further and as a tool for research rather than, or maybe also for teaching. But we started as a tool for research, and this doesn't mean that we don't appreciate the more stable kind of old-fashioned anthology, but they have another role, so I think they can coexist. And I think the traditional anthology might be less interesting today, possibly because in the old times it was a way to bring out articles from the archives which were very hard to come by. So now, as more and more articles and texts are digitalized and found on the net, it's easier to do that yourself, and it's maybe better to leave some guide to trajectories or even fragments to allow a more active reader, maybe. I think that at least is something that can be developed further.
Okay, I think yes, I agree with Matthias and Luis also, because in the end, fragmentary thought is completely connected to contemporary experience of social networks and the experience of unlearning from architecture. This is clear because we also think that when we go through fragments and when we look for the source for research or for teaching in architecture, there is also a conflict. Because even if Instagram doesn't have like proper scientific ways of researching, it has this power of the glance that Matthias explained, of looking at things with very little prejudice and very superficial. And superficiality, it's very important in fragmentary thought. For example, I don't know, people that is talking about the modular and Kim Kardashian path and the ways of a very superficial thought that is based on glancing at something or watching. This is because it's more related to architecture, but even watching hombres, mujeres y viceversa, that I don't know how you say it in English, men, women, and vice versa, which is a program that plays handsome men, handsome women, and they try to talk to each other in a very scandalous space. But this program is where the real political conflicts for society, but also for architecture, are talked about. They talk about the furniture of a flat. I don't like it. It's very extravagant. You have to relax. I like minimal, or abortion. It's the space where these things are being debated today. And I don't think, even if they are fragments and not based on classical research, things could be done. And of course, the tools. I don't know. For me, a reference that is amazing is Bestiario, this Catalan visualizators of data, that I think is very important, how we organize and select information to work with fragments. Very important.
Say something in regard to this. I think that for me, it was from the very beginning when we started reading your papers, this particular one on the fragment was quite interesting, but I think there was a misrepresentation here, to the of of the concept of the fragment. And I think in the presentation it becomes clear that the confrontation between the database and the fragment is a very significant issue, and it raises the further discussion whether we are talking about the content of the ontologies and whether we have to separate that idea of what goes into the ontology from what is the structure or the format of the ontology, which is the media or the medium through which we structure the ontology, which I think are two different issues. But altogether, I think you talk about Benjamin, you talk about the fragment, you talk about the Arcades project, and you talk about the collector, and the images appear on the screen. And I think that the problem with the argument of the concept of the fragment is that the fragment it's something that it's linked to the collector and to the idea of the collection in the first place, and it's linked to the idea of the incapacity to produce or to describe a reality in a comprehensive way or making sense. That's the origin of Benjamin's 1936 description of a society that had exploded in pieces and made no sense whatsoever, political and historical reasons. But then there's also this idea of the collector as somebody which is a colonial figure. It's a person that goes to other worlds, who behaves like a colonial anthropologist that goes to other places, physically or directly or indirectly, and brings back all those fragments, all those elements that get collected in the museum or in the room or in the domestic space of the collector and become another world. They create another relationship, they achieve another meanings, and they become another thing. Or the fragment is the ruin, or whatever we think, whichever way we think about the fragment, it brings us back to the beginning of the 20th century or even to the I think that the problem of the fragment is that that is a very loaded concept. And even if we link it to collage, that Silvia was talking yesterday, the cubist collage opens up the gaps to show the fragment. But it would be more radical to think about the surrealist photomontage, in which by not showing the gaps, you simulate a reality that is more unstable because it simulates something that is not. And it brings it back to the world of images that have to do with the digital era, in which you don't even know whether the image corresponds to something which is material reality somewhere else. So I think that the problem of the fragment versus the issue of the database is one that is very significant. It talks about the medium through which we collect those contents in the different anthologies, because at the end, the database and the digital mechanisms actually have created the new environment in which knowledge is being produced in a more contemporary way. And the problem with the concept of the fragment is that at the end of the day, when compared with the database and the information society, it cannot relinquish its original romantic 19th century origin.
And because I had a similar impression on the notion of the fragment, in the sense that somehow I think we could say that the fragment, in its very etymological meaning, comes from a whole, so there is always some sort of whole in the notion of the fragment, because a fragment is a broken piece of something. And I mean, Robin Evans, I think, describes pretty well this condition of the fragment. And I was wondering, wouldn't it be more effective to work on the notion of the parts, just parts, rather than a fragmented something? Like, for instance, Roland Barthes in his discourse, in his Lover discourse, he makes all of these fragments, but there is a discourse, there is a whole, even though contradictory. Rather, if we want to go in this more rhizomathic, just go in with parts, incoherent parts that do not try to reconstruct any whole. Even though probably the whole now is more interesting. I don't know, but yeah. And a second question, if I may, to the last presentation, you used the metaphor of the travel agency. So just a stupid question. Is there any chance to be a critic like Airbnb is now?
I can start with this. Of course, this is the controversy, but also it's because the fragment resists always databases, and it's not a part, because naming it as a part is that it's a part of a whole, and the whole point is that fragments, one of the most risky and most potential that they have is not belonging to a part. Of course, the critic is that fragments, it's a very useful notion for colonialism and for capitalism, because it's super individualistic. The fragments require of each of us to produce this wholeness without trying to produce the collective. And this is a super controversial critic, because the fragment always fosters individuality, and it's not the best instrument for collective communication. And this is one of the main problems that we can discuss further. But in some sense, for me, it's also very important that it requires and uses time as a resistance for different kinds of knowledge, in which it requires a lot of time from each of us to work with it, instead of parts, which makes us put them together, back them together.
Yes, I agree with you. I think the idea of the fragment, if you relate it to the part, is that the fragment can be used to build a lot of different wholes, whereas the part kind of makes you think that it's a part of one whole or something like that. When it comes to, I think it's the fragment, it might be connotations to the 19th century and to the collector, but I think it's still a very kind of powerful or useful concept today. I think, computers also have fragments in them. That's not just databases in the digital world, but there are lots of fragments, things and information that ends up in the wrong places. I think one way to answer this is just to say something about why I started myself to write the fragment anthology once, which was a failure, of course, but nevertheless I did it. And it was just that after doing research for maybe 20 years about territoriality, I come through a lot of quotes and interesting things that I remember, that somehow have clung with me, that have resonated in me. I started to just write them down, and without knowing what connects these fragments, these kind of pieces or memories from my research. But somehow so I started to set them down. I had maybe 150 from different books through history. And they, of course, all related to a theme. So it was not just haphazardly put together. It was territoriality through territorial culture through urban history, you could say. And when I started to get these fragments in a whole, I tried to make sense of them. And I could, of course, see that I could write several books about this, but how should I put them together? And I started to search for themes. So I used the fragments and the collection of fragments as a way to find interesting themes of territoriality through history, which came up through this work. And then when I thought about, could you publish anything like this, I think I was interested in keeping it quite open. So to make these themes, which I found through the fragments, quite weak, but still there. So there is a series of weak themes which are put together in this kind of anthology of territorial culture through urban history. So for me, it was actually a practical experience. That fragment, it's useful. To me, it was, at least, but not to the publisher. So let's see.
Want to be published?
Well, I find very interesting the use of fragments, but I think they also have a great risk, of course, is to be decontextualized. And if you try to look where a fragment has been taken from, sometimes it's very hard to find it. So that's I think, is where hyperlinks become very interesting. To link fragments to parts, to the whole of a text, so that in an easy way we can have both the part, the fragment, and also be able to realize if the fragment is really saying what who edited it is attempting to do or was used in a different context. I think it is also important. And well, the question, I'm not sure if you mean to criticize the whole Airbnb platform or just the critic that is done from other users.
No, no, it was just, yes. No, what I mean is that somehow we have this more discretized knowledge through our daily because their editorial project is basically put everywhere, and then I think according to them it's up to the reader to decide whatever it's more interesting to them. But on the other hand, we also have, I don't know, people like Andrew Kovacs or Stock Studio who are trying, using these media and these forms of archival and anthological research, to do some work as critics using different. So it was just a metaphor in the sense that probably as there is Airbnb today in front of somehow killed the travel agencies, maybe how do you think we can develop new forms?
Yes, back to the metaphor of Airbnb, I think that they also, you receive mails from them suggesting to go somewhere because the price dropped down or because it's a great event somewhere else and invite you to go there. So that in some way they are influencing you. At the moment, our architectural platform pushing you to some contents more than others? I don't think so at the moment. What maybe it is also interesting that is something that is in the written paper, but I didn't mention today, is how, for example, Art Daily has a part of the projects which they call Art Daily Classics, which are more formal texts with more documented images, plans about architecture of the past. They call classic, but for example, the Pay Pyramid in Paris is a classic, or Sao Paulo terminal is also already a classic, and it is only 20 years old, maybe. So in this way, I think they are influencing, because they are giving a level to some projects on top of others. But you cannot surf on just classics. You find them just Googling, so that at the moment, I don't think they are influencing choices or trends or other aspects. But I'm sure that in the future, they will do it, because at the end, contemporary society is based on big data. So the biggest incomes of companies are from big data. And big data of architecture is in this platform. So that we are going to use them sometimes in the future.
I would like to read the paragraph of Hayes ontology, to which I think Rodrigo was referring before in his lecture, because it's really, really nice. It's just before the. He says, the world is a totality. It is an essential and an essentially practical problems of theory to rearticulate this totality, to produce the concepts that relate the architectural fact with the social, historical, and ideological subtext from which it was never really separated to begin with. No, it's because for me this is like a resume of the idea of the will to ontology that Lavin criticized. No, that will of the ontology, because I think it's like a kind of romantic nostalgia in these words. No, it's like something was before, the unity was lost, and we have, or the theorist kind of hero has to reconstruct it, no, through theory. No? And it's very funny that Hayes or Jamieson, at least Jamieson, describe Benjamin's as a nostalgic. Really funny, no? Because I think the Benjamin's concept of fragment and also the collection is, on the contrary, is the opposite. No, it's because the collection is like the structure that led the fragment as a fragment to be a fragment. No? And the fragment with free from the significance that the historical linearity or the historical official history for free the collection, because the fragment cannot free itself. It needs another fragment to make a constellation, free and to make these fragments of the past relevant for the present. No? In this kind of free significance that this fragment has. No? So for me, it's the opposite. Is the fragment is interesting not as a piece in a montage that the editors develop, no, but as a fragment, one fragment is the experience of the fragment, and this is related with allegory and this kind of void that the fragment opens in the present.
Interesting that the next sentence that he says there is that what he wants to do is, and this is why you named it, and I wanted to read it yesterday night, is that he wants to rationally reconstruct not history as it really happened, but the very concept of history. I think I was quite close to what he said. And rationally reconstruct is one of the critiques that we do when working with fragments. I don't want to get into this, but I don't think fragments can be rationally reconstructed to take all the advantages that they have.
So, talking about this idea of fragment, I mean, on the one hand, it's true that art daily and media of the sort, they operate with these logics of the Diogenes syndrome, right? They're taking everything, mostly trash, right? And they're gathering everything. So maybe the true nature of the fragment is in those media. But beyond the format of the anthology, I wanted to ask you that I think that the idea of navigation through information is really relevant right now. So what do we do about those formats of anthology when our perception and our navigation is already fragmented? So what is the effect of that source information could have on that kind of navigation that we find everywhere nowadays?
Well, and I don't know if I'm speaking on behalf of the group, but at least in my point of view, I think at least in Brazil, one problem that we constantly have is that we don't even have a proper old-fashioned anthology, and then we are already in the digital era, and we skipped a step. So in some way, we are at this time we're quite old school in the way that we are doing our research, and I'm always thinking if we have to keep the pace and and go to the next step, or in fact really make the foundation that we lost when we had to do before. And in fact, responding what question that you asked before about the categories, right? Keep surviving in time as the time evolves, and this is in fact a big concern for us at this moment, to discover which should be the categories of a Brazilian anthology, because I'm sure that they wouldn't be the same as Cuthbert uses. For example, the category of philosophy maybe shouldn't be that important in Brazil. It could be quite weak, but we could have other categories that we could use and could explain and could be epistemological relevant for our background.
Maybe, I'm thinking about it after your question, maybe the project published everywhere are fragments, because we only show the best part of these projects. The better images, we hide what's ugly or not well resolved, so that the end is fragment, best part of a project. We don't have a whole vision of a building, or I'm thinking about building through any of these platforms, or either published articles, so that maybe there should find a way to have a better and greater presentation of objects. Which kind of objects is saying, in order to have the full comprehension about.
Yeah, so I think we need to move on. Unfortunately, I would just like to make one last remark, because I think it's a little bit problematic to make very direct associations between platforms like Our Daily and bring them to a discussion on theory and things like that, because I don't think that when we discussed about theory in other moments, we consider architectural digest. We focused on oppositions, or I think that that's important to make clear from the outset. But I think something interesting and relevant and challenging, I think, for theory in general, or for architectural theory in particular, in relation to let's say, the environment where these platforms are certainly striving and becoming something very dominant almost anywhere, is it's a question relating to actually the capacity of digital technologies to archive, file, and process everything, basically. So all historical information, all present information, okay? And because of their processing capacities, we can access them directly, with no intermediation, kind of. So that is, you were speaking about science or antique science, kind of, at some point in your lecture, and that's. I think the problem with this new environment is that rather than synthesizing theories, concepts from a number of cases, because we needed to do that in order to process and store all the information. So theory was necessary as a way of filtering that information and turning it into something, an instrument to interpret reality and to build reality. Right now, the thing is that all the cases are there, next to each other. We can access them same level, so with no mediation. So how that changes actually the need for theory, and how then theory takes on that challenge, I think it's an important question for the future in this environment.
It's because it's also promotion. I'm trying to get Matthias into a book that I thought is about orphans in architecture, like buildings that their architects never will never say that they did the project. And it's very important with archives and the digital to be also critical, because not everything is not archived and and is completely lost. And especially, for example, the first building of Zaha Hadid, that you don't know, is a social building in Berlin that is never published. It's in any it's not in any architectural magazine, and will never be part of this digital database. But still, it's a very important lost fragment.
There will be a point when the archive is as big as history, no? So we'll see. Okay, thank you very much.